Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Brilliant. The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, is one of my favorite movies. I think it represents the absolute pinnacle of fantasy storytelling on the big screen, surpassing even its two excellent follow-ups. Honestly, I thought about catching up on Rings of Power, a show I didn't enjoy much in season 1, and talking about that instead, but it's been a long week, and I'm in the mood to talk about something I love. So I'm just gonna dispense with any more preamble and just get into why this movie remains so incredible.
Oh, Sam. Samwise Gamgee, my dearest hobbit, friend of friends.
So the Fellowship opens with the kind of long exposition sequence that I've come to dread in genre movies. It's an info dump with a lot of ground to cover and little time to get through it all, especially in the theatrical version. But despite all of this, all the backstory it needs to cover and characters that won't even be in the rest of the film but need to be explained. Also, honestly, this shot of Sauron that I always thought looked kinda goofy as hell, I think that opening plays beautifully. And that's really no small feat. Now, some of the most memorable lines from Galadriel's monologue are taken directly from Tolkien verbatim, inserted in new contexts. But large stretches of it aren't, and they had to find a way to weave all of this information together and digestible in under 10 minutes. It's a credit to Peter Jackson and screenwriters Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens that it has a real sense of mystery and tension, even among all this information. Like many blockbusters since have tried to front-load their exposition in similar openings, and very few of those openings are memorable at all, failing to create any palpable sense of atmosphere. Like just this year, Cate Blanchett narrated the opening for another movie, Borderlands, which maybe has the clunkiest first 10 to 15 minutes in a movie that I've seen in a while. Like this opening might not seem that spectacular to you, but I've seen so many movies try to do this since then and fall flat on their face that it becomes all the more impressive. Oh, and speaking of Blanchett, she was absolutely the right choice to open Fellowship. Now, the easy picks for that opening narration would have been Frodo or Gandalf, and from what I understand, they even tried to see if either one of those would work before they eventually settled on Galadriel. And I don't think it would work nearly as well without her. That character, as played by Blanchett, just has this ethereal, unknowable sense of mystery, and that goes a long way to making the narration feel like this ancient, powerful text and not a rushed setup. And when it comes to an end, the tone changes pretty drastically as we're led into the wistful, serene hills of Hobbiton. I know some people find the Shire part of this movie slow, but I really disagree. For one thing, the film does cut down considerably from the novel, and it does that in some very smart ways. For example, in the book there's a fairly lengthy conversation between Sam's gaffer and some of the older hobbits about how strange Bag End, Bilbo, and Gandalf are. Tolkien uses this to fill us in a bit on what's happened since The Hobbit, but it also effectively paints a portrait of what the community of the Shire is. It's charming and beautiful, yes, filled with mostly kind-hearted hobbits. But there's also a real provincial streak there, a distrust of the outsider, and anything that would shake up their peaceful little lives, at least coming from some of the older busybody types. Now Jackson removes this scene, but that Proudfoot giving Gandalf the stink eye is a lighthearted way to communicate the same idea, which I think works really well. The Shire is easily the hardest part of the novel to take from a fanciful 1954 book and place into the context of a 2001 blockbuster. So much of the last half of that first book feels very recognizable to us as the structure of like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign or a fantasy video game. That's no accident. Obviously, those things exist in large part because of Lord of the Rings, along with countless other fantasy novels. The large band of different fantasy beings going on a big adventure together is just something that's going to feel very familiar and comfortable to us. And I honestly don't know if the same can be said for the Shire portion of that first book. It feels very culturally specific to the time and place that Tolkien wrote it. And we might take it for granted now, but I think it would have been very easy for the hobbits and the Shire to feel pretty wrong in live action in the 2000s, and to kind of exist on this old-timey, kitschy wavelength that people may not have connected to. Instead, the Shire, with its rolling hills and beautiful soundscape, became one of the most beloved aspects of these films. I think a large part of that is that Jackson and company made some smart adjustments when creating their versions of our main hobbits. Now, I love the hobbits of the books, and the films make sure to keep a lot of what's so great about them fully intact. Their courage, humor, and good-hearted stubbornness. But honestly, they do feel like middle-aged men in the novels. Merry and Pippin are not troublemaking youths stealing from Farmer Maggot. Frodo remembers doing that when he was a kid, but that time in their lives is behind them. Hell, Merry is the master of Buckland, and he has this really large house, at least by Hobbit standards. This is not me trying to say they're like sticks in the mud or anything. Merry is witty, and he does lead the group to discover what Frodo and Gandalf were doing without the two noticing. But to many today, I suspect they just don't read like young adults. Now, Tolkien did intend for them to be fairly young hobbits, at least at the beginning of the story. So it's not like the movie completely overhauled their ages. I think it's more of a case of what reads as a young person to us now, or even in the 2000s, is not how Tolkien approached it in the early 50s. Obviously, the cultural context is just very different. And while I'm sure it annoys some fans of the novels, I think Jackson does a great job at preserving the youthful coming-of-age aspect of the hobbits going on their first big adventure by changing the characterization just enough for it to be easily understood as that by the 2000s audience. I think it's an understandable tweak that still preserves what people loved about their journey in Fellowship. I don't mean to make it sound like I think Jackson or the film are embarrassed by the non-action movie friendly aspects of this story. There's not many big fantasy films that are totally comfortable spending a long amount of time with two elderly actors just discussing things over tea. Jackson clearly has confidence in the quality of his source material, and a willingness to let the audience just sit with these characters, whether they're discussing birthday plans or annoying neighbors. And I wish it was something more big genre movies like this had. It's the accumulation of those moments, of all that time spent in the Shire, that gives Sam's farthest step away from home a real sense of meaning. A movie that was more ruthless about getting the gang into action as fast as possible, I don't think could land that moment, which is played so earnestly, nearly as well. But of course, it's not all cozy music and pipeweed. I love the ring wraiths in this movie so much. I know down the line we eventually see them in cool helmets with flying dragons. Sure, great. I think they're best here. The quiet search for the ring on horseback, before they even do much, is so effective and creepy. These old, cursed creatures just quietly slipping into the Shire, growling out a few questions at those unlucky enough to cross their path. I really believe the Nazgul are some of Tolkien's best creations, and Jackson, with his background making horror movies, does them justice and then some. Now, I do kind of miss things like the gang getting lulled to sleep by the old forest, the strange mystery of Tom Bombadil, and maybe most of all, Tolkien's fascinating exploration of Bree, where he breaks down how this very unique multicultural town functions and gives it a lot of great historical texture. But in a movie as long as this one, it's pretty understandable none of that made the cut. Butterbur, the tavern keeper, has a much smaller role here, but it's a fun little performance, and of course he introduces us to Strider, one of the luckiest bits of casting you'll ever see. I won't linger on the story too much. I'm assuming that most of you already know that Viggo Mortensen was a very last-minute addition to the cast, replacing another actor named Stuart Townsend. I think it almost goes without saying that it's hard to imagine Aragorn as played by anyone else now. I also really like the choices that the screenwriters made here. It's not just that in this version Aragorn is a reluctant king figure, initially resisting taking back his crown. It's also how the movie repositions Boromir and Aragorn's relationship. We see Boromir in reverent awe of Elendil's sword, only to dismiss it the moment he sees Aragorn. This tension between them, and how it's resolved, with Aragorn committing to his duty to Gondor before Boromir's death, is, I think, one of the most inspired ideas of the whole trilogy. And Sean Bean's performance wonderfully straddles this thin line between slightly insecure petulance and a true sense of honor just so well, giving us the most flawed and maybe the most admirable character in the movie. Like, Gimli and Legolas get a lot of fun moments, but I think it's Boromir who steals the show in Fellowship. He can be dismissive and angry at times, but he's so much more than just the guy who tries to steal the ring. I love that scene in Lothlorien, speaking to Aragorn about his father's failing reign, where it's clear that he has the weight of all of Gondor on his shoulders, and lives in fear that he's going to fail his people and see it all collapse around him. Making his moment of weakness, where the ring effectively preys on those fears, very understandable and all the more tragic. Especially when the film has laid out a lot of small humanizing moments too, like him pleading to give the hobbits a moment to mourn after Moria. I could keep praising the performances, but I think instead I should shift to the design of this movie. It's hard to find something to say about the look and feel of these films that hasn't been said already, or laid out in the incredible behind the scenes stuff that we got back when home video releases were, good. But I'll give it a shot anyway. When I think of the Fellowship of the Ring and its depiction of Middle-earth, it's not Rivendell I think of first, or the Mines of Moria, or even the Shire. It's actually the forest around Amon Hen. It's Frodo walking next to a fallen statue, half buried in dirt, just before he's confronted by Boromir. Fellowship is filled with images like this, the ruins of once great fortresses, the remains of civilizations long past. In a time when so many movies on this scale feel sterile and artificial, these landscapes manage to stand out as feeling very real. And not just lived in, but bursting at the seams with a dark and glorious past just waiting to be uncovered. They share that quality with the novels, creating those feelings in different ways across two separate mediums. I could keep going. I haven't really touched on Elijah Wood and Sean Astin, or like how that dirt placenta around the first Uruk-hai is deeply gross and has haunted me since age 8, but I think it's talking about that quality that I want to end on. So much of film and TV now is begging you to become invested in its world and its lore, begging for the chance to become an ever-extendable IP. But what shines through in The Fellowship is a true expression of what they're all chasing. There's a majesty and a mystique to the Middle-earth of this film that I've just never seen matched by any other fantasy movie. Of all the things The Fellowship of the Ring successfully carried with it from the novels, that might be its most powerful. Alright, so there were some years in my life where I would have rather taken a relaxing night stroll through the Mines of Moria than engage with math on basically any level. The thing is though, it doesn't have to be that way. Brilliant.org is there to show us why. They make the process of learning way more fun and accessible than ever before, by making it incredibly interactive. It's not going through a rote textbook, it's getting feedback as you work to tackle math, science, and computer science concepts, with more classes being added all the time. And importantly, it all works on your schedule when you have the time to learn. I've been getting some good feedback on this one, so I think I'm going to once again recommend Programming with Python, where you can get familiar with Python and start building programs on day one with a built-in drag and drop editor. And where you'll learn to really think like a programmer, building a strong foundation in writing robust programs. That's just the start of what you can learn on Brilliant.org. So to try it for free for 30 days, visit Brilliant.org/midnight or click on the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. That's Brilliant.org/midnight.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.